Yeah. Along with our personal introductions, again, it was great to meet you all. We kind of want to know to kickstart the conversation more about your personal experiences and personal stories. So we'd love to know if both of you could share, again, one by one, what are your personal experiences surrounding racism within your individual communities? Again, it could be something you've witnessed or you've personally experienced, or even both.
Um, if I can begin first, if you'd like. My experience with racism in communities, it's a lot of it is very, very subtle. There, it is rare to have somebody, let's say, call you a racial slur or some other very blunt racist comment. Usually like those racist slurs that I've experienced, like the N-word and the whole deal, that happened a lot in my childhood because like a lot of people had picked it up from somewhere, and um that's an example of an incident that has happened in my childhood. And you kind of ask yourself later on where they got that from, and what kind of unconscious or conscious biases did they grow up in that this incident happened the way that it did. um, as well, my travels throughout this province, there's more often than not a lot of people tell me to be careful while or before or while traveling, because they perceive that the towns, the counties that I travel to are majority white, and some people fear that something might happen to me. Um, I have not really experienced anything. Of course, I would be coming from like a place of, let's say, male privilege talking about this, but I have yet to run into danger while traveling through rural communities based on, I guess you could say, like racial abuse or anything like that. I have heard stories, obviously. I have people have told me their own individual stories, and those are definitely to be believed and to be taken into account. But a lot of the racism I faced is very subtle in nature. Like, you don't think about it until like maybe after it happens. You have to take some time to process it. So it just reminds me of something similar to, like, the Martin Luther King quote in the letter from a Birmingham jail, where he says, the greatest enemy isn't the Klansman or whatever. It's like that white moderate who, um, like it's like they don't know that they're being racist, but the impact is something else. It's there's a stark difference between the impact and the intent. So
Yeah, I definitely can resonate with that because sometimes I would um, not notice anything until years later. Like, and then I realized, oh, maybe this was something that could have been worded differently. But at the time, because of the social expectation of wanting to fit in with most people and going with the flow of the conversation, I never really realized like what was being said until a long time after. Yeah.
Yeah, if I could go on that too. Mm, Yeah, so just growing up in rural communities, obviously, I'm speaking from the privilege of being white. But there is definitely a lot of like unconscious drops of just subtle racism in conversations, in um, just actions as well, that I think might also come from a lack of awareness. just because growing up in those communities, I know that the majority is by far not colored, or was born and like raised there and has family, like generational family there. And so they often, when someone new comes in, it is a complete turnover, and they just don't know how to act, I find, is the problem. And it's definitely a lack of awareness. And when you kind of point it out, they're often ashamed, or they didn't know how to act better because of the way that they were raised. It became a norm. Like, it became a norm to either speak that way or use that type of lingo or something else, which obviously is completely wrong and inexcusable. But yeah, definitely like the lack of awareness, and things like this podcast, bringing that awareness to those smaller communities is definitely something that is really needed, and something that has been lacking the last few years for sure, but hopefully continues to get better.
Yeah, I totally agree. Moving on to the next question, I was, because we mentioned, like, basically the unconscious biases that surround racism mostly for most people, I was wondering, how prevalent is racism in your community currently? Do you think that this unconscious bias has slowly become a little bit more conscious over time, or do you feel like as if people are still passing on those generational implicit biases?
That's a great question. Is if it's becoming conscious, but to speak to the first part of the question, it's racism in London. It's getting to be more conscious, I guess you could say. Just 2 years ago, and the trial's currently happening right now. I think it's day 20 of the Nathaniel Veltman trial, where he was alleged to have murdered the family of four, the Muslims in Hyde Park. And yeah, and it brought a lot of bad, I guess you could say, bad experiences with racism to the forefront. A lot of Londoners, a lot of people in the area shared, their stories. The local progressive conservative candidate in that area for the 2014 election, I met him. He had posted a note on Facebook about how he experienced he was a witness, I guess you could say, to incidents of subtle racism. He's white, and he was the successor candidate of that party to this Arab man who had contested the by-election about a year prior, and there was a lot of comments. The white PC candidate had observed that a lot of people at the doors would say, "Oh, I'm glad someone like you is our candidate. I tried volunteering last year, but the office reminded me of the Middle East," and a bunch of other comments about like just subtle comments alluding to like race and language and stuff like that. And he had brought up a great point that he bluntly said London's a racist city that pretends it isn't, and it brought up like a lot of things for me, like how people were they would say things, they would couch it behind language or other actions, but they weren't actively, let's say, calling me the N-word or they weren't using like outward racist tropes or whatever, but I was like thinking back then, oh wow, this person was really trying to say it with their whole chest, but they couldn't because they knew it wasn't, I guess, socially acceptable, so they couched it behind some coded language. But I have faced, I guess you could say, a bit of an uptick of that now conscious mask off, um, I've been called the N word while biking on a bike path or whatever. Like, it's people are getting out there. I guess people are we're in a more polarized world politically, and people aren't afraid to like just get out there and say whatever is on their mind in that respect. So yeah, it's London's got a bit of a problem with racism, and often they people feel that they can just kind of stick it behind a corner and just say, no, we're a progressive community, we're all welcoming here. But like, there's that other side of it, where people have this resentment towards multiculturalism and the like. So yeah, it's a bit of a problem. It's kind of burgeoning, and it's people are not afraid to hide, I guess, their hate, in my view.
Yeah, Cedric, I think it's absolutely like valid concern. Personally, as a student here, and I'm not sure about Yvonne's perspective, but I'm not as involved in the municipal elections. But I think it definitely, I've seen instances or heard instances just, being in the student community here of racist comments, microaggressions towards the candidates here that we elect within our own student body. Um, and it's surprising, considering how diverse of a city London is, and within the student body as well, we have representatives from everywhere representing many nationalities and ethnicities. And even then, um, even with all the education and all the awareness that we see on campus, we still continue to hear these comments, even within our own election. So definitely is surprising. Kirsten, do you have anything to touch on that as well?
Yeah, sorry. Does someone mind repeating the question? I know it was something about seeing it go down as well, but I just want to make sure I answer each point.
Of course, it was just about the prevalence of racism in your community. And of course, it can be blatant, but also, as Cedric was mentioning, it could also just be the presence of microaggressions too. Yeah.
Okay, so just specifically looking at like how the prevalence might be either decreasing or increasing. Okay, yeah. So I don't know. I think that with the amount of, as you guys have said, like multiculturalism and a lot of diversity has slowly seeped its way into more rural communities, I think it definitely is improving. I think obviously this seems to be a topic that will always be prevalent. Unfortunately, like no matter how much we do or no matter how much we change, there will always be those people that are a little bit stubborn. And just hopefully it's not a generational curse. Hopefully, eventually it can wean itself out. I think also with the prevalence of online schooling has really, because of COVID, has really also managed to help get people a little bit out of their own communities. As well as social media, like that's been a huge deal as well. And it just, like I said earlier, it's just a whole thing of awareness. Just being able to get these people outside of their communities and open their eyes has really been helpful. So yeah, I could see it going down. Hopefully, the prevalence decreases and diminishes. But yeah, like I said, I'm not sure how fast that will be.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's really interesting how racism has been, I feel like, more aware in most people's minds. But the thing is, the awareness doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to be less racist. Like, it's interesting how the more aware someone is, the more strongly they might feel about it. So it's interesting. Yeah, it's like kind of like what Cedric said, like it's polarizing. Like the more it's prevalent in society, the more people are going to be polarized, which is unfortunate. But yeah, that seems like what it's been doing the past few decades. Um, yeah, so for the next question, it's more touching on specifically urban and rural areas. So if you have any input or like any comparison, I know Cedric, you say that you travel across for journalism. So I'm really interested in your point of view on this question. So do you think issues of racism are different in urban versus rural areas in your opinion, or have you heard anything that uh, that basically signifies that it's a lot different, or no?
I for in my experience, again, I've lived in London my whole life, so it's more that I have more of an urban experience. A lot of I feel that they manifest like these issues of racism between communities. They manifest themselves differently through each community, no matter whether it's like London. Like London, people aren't saying it with their, even though it's like getting up there, in terms of like outward racism, people still aren't, for the most part, saying it um, with their whole chest or whatever, like a racial slur, or they're not doing a cross burning or whatever, for example. But in rural communities, I have found, yeah, that and I haven't seen it with my own two eyes, but I've read about it because I just from time to time I'll read like a small town newspaper that I pick up or whatever. In May of 2021, it was April or May of 2021, so about 2.5 years ago, I did a bike ride to New Hamburg, which is in Wilmot Township, which is just west of Kitchener, so it's kind of in the shadow of the GTHA there. And I was reading a newspaper that I picked up in the grocery store, and it talked about a White Lives Matter rally happening, and that scared the crap out of me to just um, put it succinctly, um, like I'm in this town, and not too long ago there was this White Lives Matter rally, and I guess Wilmot was contending with I guess a racial reckoning, I guess you could call it. And there was a township councilor who had a racialized partner, and put up with a lot of racial abuse because of his background, and he was very outspoken against racism, and I was just like, wow, this is wild that like they're they're dealing with that out in the open, and I'm not naive about it, but it's still just wild to just see it. Like, um, but yeah, like rural communities, in my experience, there's been a real it's been a real point of contention, like dealing with racism, or racist reckoning, I guess you could call it, especially now that you have, I guess, increased racialized populations in these small communities, in these townships. But yeah, there's a difference, but it's not so much stark between urban and rural communities. They just manifest themselves differently depending on like who's there.
Yeah, that's really cool to hear because I haven't had much experience myself living in a rural community or going to rural communities. So I definitely don't feel like there's a big difference myself personally from what I've experienced. But yeah, I definitely have to um, experience more and to see like what the specific differences are. Like you said, like the small ways that it manifests itself. Yeah. Kristen, do you have anything to add?
Sounds great. Then we'll pivot it off to more of a different context here. Um, of course, it was kind of mentioned briefly in some of the back and forth we had for the previous questions, but um, what would you both say about educational spaces? Do you think educational spaces in your community specifically would be considered a safe and welcoming place to people of various races?
I can go first for this one if you don't mind, Cedric. Sorry. Yeah, so just growing up in a small town, I know that in elementary school, it was definitely a white majority school. Like, I think we maybe had one colored person, but that was like in kindergarten, and then after that, there was nothing. Um, but then, like again, high school, we had like another colored family kind of came to the community, and then yeah. So I do know that there was some issues, particularly in high school. It wasn't as prevalent in elementary school, but definitely in high school there was um, not so much stigma, but definitely a lot of the microaggressions, as you guys have said before. And uh, it was definitely a topic that was brought up, and many school like assemblies and stuff were done on it. But obviously, as you guys have said, awareness does not always, change. Sometimes it can make things worse. So yeah, that was definitely something that I saw a lot. But then getting older, and also like as the years went on, we definitely had a lot more diversity was brought into the community, and personally, I saw a decrease in many things. Maybe not so much the microaggressions in everyone, but most of the people that I surrounded myself with, I guess there was less prevalence of it. But yeah, I found that educational spaces were definitely a lot better. I'm not sure if it's just the people who, like, especially in post secondary, but I'm not sure if it's just the people who go to those tend to be better people, or when it comes to like that type of stuff, like inclusion and acceptation, like acceptance and everything. But yeah.
Um, that's a great question. I last went to college about 7 years ago, but but educational spaces being like safe places for various cultures to like get together. I went to elementary school and high school in like the same corner of like northwest London, and we it was a mixture of cultures. We had a lot of refugees from various places in like Europe, Asia. I was more often than not the only black student in my classes, and if I wasn't, I was probably like um, one of the only like black Canadians in my class. Um, so you get to learn from people. You get to like learn from people's various like lived experiences. That's a thing that's, I guess you could say, built in infrastructurally. But again, like awareness doesn't always translate to like, I guess you could say, racial harmony, because people will still have the capacity to, I guess, whether it's like microaggressions or something outright with their whole chest, where it depends on like people's own environment at home, where um they're, I guess, instilled with various their own values from their own family, and with that comes like various biases, whether they're unconscious or not. And going into college, I went to Fanshawe. I'm not sure like how it's. I'm not entirely sure how it's changed when it comes to like international students. But it was when I went there for the years that I went there, it was a diverse place nonetheless. But I had more. I think half the class came from like a small town around like London, like whether it was Kincardine or Stratford or Chatham Kent or Simcoe. But there wasn't much in the way of like racial tension, I guess you could say. It was a safe place for us all to kind of get together and interact with each other, no matter where we came from. I'm not sure what it's like at Fanshot today, but that is my experience like in the educational world.
Yeah, thank you both. I can personally, I can kind of relate with Kirsten. I went to middle school for a few years in a school where it was a majority. It was Caledon, so just the population there is different from where I was just a bit farther north. Um, but I wouldn't say it was unsafe. It's just there's a bit of a lack of shared understanding about some things that come up in conversation as a kid or just about life as a whole. Um, and those differences kind of evaporate a bit more as you get older, I guess, because maybe you go into more diverse spaces or people just are more educated about the world, and that's natural as you age. Um, yeah, for sure. And I'll hand it off to Yvonne for the next question.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think teens are always a little mean in high school, so that's definitely a factor. I at Western currently, like as a student from Western, I do think Western is a safe space or a generally safe space for people of all races. And I think that's because of I do get like a lot of emails actually, or like emails every year talking about EDI. So I do think Western is doing a pretty like a decent job at this topic in general. So what do you guys think are educational spaces in your community are uh, actively engaging or doing anything about racism?
I think, like you've kind of said, there's definitely a lot of things in newsletters, emails sent out to the students. There's definitely a lot of clubs as well that do such a great job, like student-led clubs that do such a great job of uh, the advocacy and everything. I also do think that the institutions also do sometimes a really good job of like the celebratory days or supporting students when it comes to things like rallies or um, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting words today, but yeah, gatherings and things like that. I think that the schools and institutions have always done a good job of that. Um, I I will say that like I've noticed like professors or teachers always seem to be very supportive and definitely try to their best abilities to make it an inclusive space. Yeah, that's my experience.
Yeah, I've noticed that professors especially are more attentive to to the topics compared to my like high school or elementary school teachers. Cedric, do you have? I know you went to college like a while ago, but if you have anything to add, or we can move on to the next question.
Certainly. That's a great question. Going even a bit further back, about teachers, about professors, about institutions kind of having their grasp on, I guess you could say, the subject of race. I did not have a black teacher until grade 11. And I believe today she is one of like less than a handful of black teachers in the school board. It's a big school. It's one of the largest school boards in the province where it's 3 counties and like tens of thousands of students. Yeah, and only like 3 black teachers. So you I was able to, for that one particular semester in 2008, I was able to like, I guess you could say, see myself. They were like, the teacher was talking about things that I had only, some things that I had mainly only heard in the home. And I was like, wow, I can see myself, I guess, reflected in, if only for this one particular class. So when I found out that she was like one of 3 Black teachers, I was like, wow, we have a lot of work to do. In getting, I guess you could say, a faculty or a, like, that looks like our region. But in general, schools, I guess you could say, they do their best, but a lot of it does kind of, when you, for example, when you get called the N word in, like, or some other, or microaggression or something outward, a lot of these strategies to address, equity, diversity, inclusion, a lot of them, in my previous experience, they miss that a lot of people had unconscious biases and stuff like that. I didn't hear of, EDI or whatever until, like, I think a couple of years after I left college and had to do training for a volunteer position I had. So schools and institutions like that, I guess they did their best, but it was all, oh, we're all different cultures. We should all, it's automatically, we're all in racial harmony when, I think they fell short in my experience. But they did their best, but its best is not enough.
Yeah, definitely. I think, speaking of like institutions, more like institutional racism or like anti-racism. Um, what do you guys? We're gonna transition onto a more like a media's topic of racism, like under racism, and yeah, Utesh is gonna introduce that question to you guys next.
For sure. Again, we had the opportunity to converse on how education played a role, or educational institutions played a role. But would you both be able to touch on some media outlets that are popular in your community that you would say fuel or promote, even if it's on a minuscule level, racial stereotypes and biases, and if so, how do they do so?
That's a great question. So, like, specific media outlets?
If you're aware of them, for sure.
Absolutely. So in London, we have our daily, the London Free Press. We have CBC London, which is mainly online and radio. We have London News Today, which, again, online and radio. Global News, radio, online. We and then we have, I guess, we don't have many alt weeklies or any of that anymore, but the ones that I do check on a daily basis. Oh, and CTV, obviously, television. But when it comes to the subject of, oh, and we also, another media source, we have an Instagram account called the London Blog. It's tens of thousands of followers. I see that, like, traditional media, they, they have their, I guess, sometimes they do have their shortcomings when it comes to, I've noticed, in the past, there's been, like, a few incidents where they've slipped up or whatever, and they've been called out on it by peers of mine in my experience, but they do a better job than, I guess you could say, the than new media, because I'm unsure of whatever journalism training that people in new media have, but, like, I've seen like racist comments on like an Instagram post London blog will make. Like they'll say, oh, this they'll post like, oh, somebody was arrested for something, and it like a lot of comments are will go back to that person's race, for example, or there's like a cultural festival and there will be like negative comments about um there will be like jokes, racist jokes about um that particular festival, or even going outside of race into like I do recall there was in Banting where I went to high school over a decade ago, where they ripped down the pride flag, and there was until it was shut down, there was like a flurry of like homophobic and transphobic comments on that particular post. And so I do, in my experience, like traditional media, for all of its perceived faults, they have done somewhat of a better job than new media, because again, like when you're just doing citizen journalism, like there's not much in the way of like standards, and um, like you're probably not going to face repercussions other than somebody telling you, oh, you screwed up there, that kind of thing.
Yeah, you brought up some great examples, and definitely like when you're comparing the traditional outlets, for example, like a city of London to something larger for the country, there is just much less at risk. So you're right about that, and then some of the examples you mentioned are also really relevant, and I've seen it especially when it comes to reporting crime, the descriptions that are unnecessary that really make you wonder, like why was that mentioned? Why is that necessary to what's being reported on? Yeah, for sure. Kirsten, did you have anything to add on? Okay, great. We can just move on then.
Yeah. Moving on to a more general, I guess, kind of question. It doesn't necessarily have to be in your community, but what do you guys think about the issues of race intersecting with other identities that people have? Like, for example, gender or sexuality or socioeconomic status. We've often hear about intersectionality as a topic, but I feel like it doesn't get discussed or given examples as much. So I was just wondering what your guys' experience with this topic was.
That's a great question. In the Black community, I can't be a spokesperson for the Black community, but in my experience, when it comes to the intersection, and again, I'm straight, so maybe there's totally there's kind of another bias in talking about this, but there is a lot of, I guess you could say, with the intersection of race and sexuality or whatever, there's a lot of apprehensiveness for I guess you could say, like the Black community to say, like gay is okay, trans women are women, trans men are men, and stuff like that. And a lot of it, in my experience as a Black man, is tied to like religion, and a lot of depending on, I guess, whatever religious denomination or religion you have, you pick and choose whatever teachings you have and whatever religious upbringing you have. There's like, I've noticed, that apprehensiveness and stuff like that. Just the other day, I was reading, for example, about the NAACP, and this is in the US, and like Coretta Scott King, and how they had to, like, I guess, not so much twist the arms, but like they had to basically tell the Black community, hey, like LGBTQ rights. They're like the fight for civil rights, like they're the same, they're in the same fight together kind of thing. And Coretta Scott King had to say, hey, my husband would have been advocating for them as well if he was still alive. And so, yeah, with that's my experience, is like there's, I wouldn't call it tension, but there's a hesitation, there's apprehensiveness to I've seen that in my community to help join that fight for LGBTQ rights.
Yeah, I think with intersectionality, like you said, like there's an apprehensiveness to basically like combine both topics because there's so many factors that come into play when you're already part of a minority group, or there's just so many other factors that make it hard to talk about two things at once, or how these two things work together and play a role in your life. Yeah. So, Kirsten, do you have anything to add on, or like, have you heard or have you seen like a prevalence of the topic of intersectionality in rural communities, or not as much?
No, so unfortunately, to agree with you, yeah, it's a very segregated topics. Like one is always without the other. But I think Cedric hit it right on the head. There's a huge play about religion in there as well, like culture as well. Like I think it's a whole thing that needs to be brought together and really combined as an explored topic. Just because, yeah, it is definitely very very separated when you see one or the other. It's always this month is for this or this month is for this, but there's never a lot of like indulgence into how the two might work together or crossover. Yeah.
Yeah, those are both great perspectives. Personally, intersectionality was something I learned about in anthropology, but it's interesting to hear about your personal experiences and seeing that actually come to life. Um, Moving on, we talked a little bit about generations. I know Kirsten was talking about how um, the unfamiliarity with outsiders is something to do with generations of family being in the same city and not being exposed to others, or to a smaller scale. And we're also seeing more activism within the younger generation specifically. So, what role do you think the younger generation can play specifically in shaping more inclusive communities in Canada?
I think the younger generation plays a huge role, probably the most important role. Those that are either teens or young adults, I think, make the most impact. They seem to be the most involved in the advocacy. They are the most important when it comes to teaching those younger than them, like elementary school or preschool age children, just how to act. Like that. Those are the most vital years. Those are the most sensitive years to learning. And as well as the older generation, I find with in a personal experience, a lot of my friends or the people that I am around, it's always like, oh, my parents do this, or oh, I can't really tell my parents this because they have this stigma or this bias or something like that. And it is upsetting, and I get that. I get the fear and the apprehension of speaking to their parents in a certain way, which is so funny and ironic considering that these are the same people that I see out on the street willing to fight a complete stranger or stand up to a complete stranger, but is completely terrified to even talk to their own family about it. Yeah, definitely an interesting point, but yeah, like I said, I think the younger generation plays the most important role, considering those are the ones that tend to do and not think. Not in a bad way, but in a good way, more so that they take action. tend to be the ones that step out there and do the grunge work and get things going. Yeah.
Yeah, that's also very relatable to me personally. My parents are weren't raised in Canada, or so they were raised in an environment where the people around them were very similar to them, and sometimes they would make comments. Obviously, they're not bad people, but it's those implicit biases that us younger generations have to call out. Sometimes I am really scared to call them out, but I do remind them every time that they um, say these unconscious biases, that to consider a different perspective. And yeah, I feel like that the best way to approach the older generation, especially your parents, is to try to understand how they're thinking of these um, implicit biases first, and then because you are their children and you do know them a lot more than total strangers, it's definitely best for your own family to call you out than other people. So yeah. Cedric, do you have anything or any personal experiences with this topic?
Yeah, I'd like to touch on it briefly with regards to like the role that the younger generation plays. Um, they don't have, I guess you could say, they have baked in the, you know, I guess the least amount of like um biases or whatever compared to older generations and stuff like that. You know, the older you get, I guess you get set in your ways. Not to put it in a black and white thing, but of course, for the sake of argument here, um but the role that they play is to like set the table and to make it better for other generations, to kind of leave that world behind and like to instill in future generations I guess better practices for interacting with people. I've known this, you know, as like someone who's getting older, like seeing how the younger generation is interacting with each other. So yeah, they're just to end it off with, you know, like their goal is to set the table for the next several generations.
Yeah, that's very that's insightful, because oftentimes we think of how can we fix things by changing what has already happened, but it's definitely also very important to think about how we can set things up for the future. And to end off this podcast with the last question, um, we basically talked about this a little bit, but do you guys think that there are any opportunities for intergenerational involvement? And to make this question more specific, how can the youth engage with older generations, or just people in general that might be more closed off in their ways of thinking? So how can we try to communicate with people that are stubborn, or that have a hard time opening their minds to these topics?
If I could start off here, with you have to that's a really interesting question. Part of me wants to say, you know, you have to meet people where they're at first, and then kind of slowly over time bring them to where you're at. It's you know, because again, like the older generation, for lack of a better term, older generations, they have their biases that are going to take a while to, I guess, be reconciled with reality and that kind of thing. And I guess you could say shaming wouldn't do much in the way of like, you know, reconciling the generations, because like it'll keep them stuck where they're at, and they'll kind of burrow even further.
Yeah, I agree with that last point particularly. I think any type of shaming is just gonna make people more uh like it's just gonna antagonize people. It's just gonna make them more defensive, and defensive people tend to get more aggressive, and more aggressive means a little bit more mean. I think regarding the intergenerational collaboration, I think it's a great idea, and obviously it needs to be done. Just something on a more positive note, I find that sometimes the older generation surprises me. Sometimes I'll be talking to someone who's older that I might have my own personal bias, thinking, oh, they're gonna be part of this generation, they're not gonna have the same thoughts that I do. But then they'll say something and I'm completely surprised, and it's a really pleasant surprise, because sometimes they're a lot more aware and a lot more conscious than I expected or I thought. And then that kind of feels a little bit guilty on my part, because I'm like, oh wow, like this person is way more open, this person is way more accepting than I originally had assumed. But yeah, I think there's a lot of stigma that also goes around approaching someone who is from an older generation who might have the potential of having those wrong ideas. That often I am surprised at how inclusive they are. And then just on how to communicate with these stubborn people, I find exposure is a huge part in this. Having these people talk, make conversation, for someone that they might have a complete bias against, or a stigma, or some type of microaggression or racism, having them have a conversation with that particular group of people, it often leads to something that is great. Obviously, this is not always the outcome. Sometimes it is the opposite outcome, but more often than not, I've found that it actually tends to bring some good things to the table. I find that they end up learning a lot more about that person or about that particular group of people, or they're able to crush myths or things that they might have thought that don't end up actually being true, or they get to educate themselves by having this conversation with this person firsthand, and really like open their doors and open their eyes and see that maybe things are not always as they thought. Maybe the things that were passed down to them are not actually true. Yeah.
Yeah, Kirsten, thank you for that positive note, because you're definitely right. There are instances where you do talk to an older person, and surprisingly, they're more progressive than you'd assume, and hopefully that's a trend we see going forward. In 50 years, people can look at the older generation and say, "Oh, everybody's progressive," and it's a normal thing. It's not something uncommon, something you don't expect. But yeah, thank you both. Thank you, Cedric and Kirsten, for joining this episode of the Clearing a New Path podcast. Overall, your perspectives were incredibly valuable. They shined a light on the different takes from both types of communities, rural and urban, and that was really, really insightful. And to our audience, thank you for tuning in. We hope to see you next time.